Once you have completed the knitting on any lace shawl, but especially on the lace shawl pattern Begin the Beginning, and I'll put a link in the comments to that full pattern. When you're binding off, it's important that you are doing a very, very loose bind off. So generally the bound off edge of any project tends to be a little bit tighter than the knitted fabric. So you can kind of illustrate that by if you pull the knitted fabric, you have a little bit of stretch going on there, and when you pull the bound off edge, it doesn't move, it doesn't stretch. And that's because just the nature of knitted fabric, the loops tend to slide around in each other compared to the bound off edge. You're taking kind of one loop and pulling it over the other one, and so there's just not as much opportunity for flexibility in there. So anytime you're binding off at all, you need to be aware that your bind off edge is likely going to be tighter than your knitted fabric. Lace is going to make that even more pronounced because your fabric has so much movement with those open spaces, and you are going, when you block it, you are going to be stretching your fabric so much you want to make sure that your bound off edge is going to be loose enough to stretch comfortably with the rest of your lace. And when you're doing something that has a very long bound off edge, so this shawl, your bound off edge goes all the way around the full square. There's just a lot of sort of yards of bound off edge on there. If you were doing a scarf and you just had your bound off edge was the two narrow ends of the rectangle on a more traditional scarf piece, you still wouldn't want it to pull in and be too tight there, but it wouldn't be as dramatic if you had made that bind off too tight as it will be in this piece. So you will notice in this exact piece, your bound off edge, you do have these larger holes right at the apex of the kind of rounded picot edges there. And that is achieved in the two rows before your bound off edge. So that's already done. You're not adding that as you go. You're following your pattern exactly. You'll already have that in, and you'll have done one row on top of that before it's time to bind off. So when you're actually doing the bind off, the pattern gives you two recommendations. The first one uses just the needles that you have been knitting your piece on all along. And so this particular pattern, you are using a US size 6 needle, and the pattern is going to recommend that when you're doing your bind off edge, you knit your stitch with the exact needles you've been using the whole time, just like normal. But before you go ahead and knit that second stitch to do your bind off, you make that loop intentionally big enough that you feel like you could comfortably get two needles in there. So you've got one in there, you're going to make that loop big enough that you feel like you could get a second one in there. And then you're going to knit your second stitch as a part of just the normal bind off. You're going to do that exact same thing, intentionally make that bigger, and do try to think about make those loops both the same size as each other. And then you're going to, as in a regular bind off, take that first knit stitch and pass it over the second one. And you're just going to do that to bind off across. So every single stitch, you are going to kind of double the size of that loop before you take one over the other. And that is going to ensure that you have a nice loose bind off. It is fairly easy if you're doing that, especially if you're not real accustomed to it, to end up with some loops that are way, way bigger than the loops on the other side, and so end up with a slightly uneven bind off. So the other way to do this is you would leave, I'm going to go ahead and pull the second one over the first one. So the other way to do this is you do not need to slide all of your stitches onto a different needle, but you are going to, just in your right hand, the one that is doing the knitting to create your bind off, you are going to grab a dramatically larger needle. I know a lot of times people will have it in their heads that if you're going to bind off with a larger needle, you want to just use something 1 or 2 sizes up. So if you're using a size 6 for your knitting, you'd bind off with a size 7 or 8. That is not going to give you enough fabric to really make that work. So I always recommend kind of double the size. If you are working with a size 6 needle, I've grabbed a size 11 needle. And you are going to knit your stitch as normal. Do make sure you don't do both of these techniques at the same time. So when you do your knit stitch here, do keep that stitch kind of tight up against the needles. Don't use a size 11 needle and then double the size. That bind off would be too loose. But you are then going to complete your bind off as normal. When you get to stitch markers, you're just going to remove that stitch marker and set it aside for your next project. So again, you're just knitting a totally normal stitch. It feels a little bit strange to have your two different needle sizes, but you get used to it pretty quickly. If you're using the larger needle, you do want to keep those stitches snug up against that needle, and then you're going to take the farther one up and over the one in front of it. And both of those techniques are going to result in a bind off that's about the same amount of stretchy. Because both of them you're getting about twice as large a loop as you would be expecting. And so that is going to give you a bind off edge that will allow you to block your final piece into these dramatic points at each spot that you're supposed to be doing that. So I hope that helped. If you haven't ever been able to successfully get a bind off as loose as you wanted it, those are two different techniques that will hopefully help you achieve that.